My mom turned my dad into a crossdresser. The first time I saw my father standing in front of the hallway mirror wearing one of my mother's cardigans, he looked less like a man pretending to be someone else, and more like someone who had spent a lifetime pretending to be himself. That image never left me. People often ask when everything changed in our family, but they're asking the wrong question. Nothing changed overnight. The truth is, my mother noticed something years before anyone else did. She always said that people reveal themselves in the smallest moments, never during celebrations, never during arguments, but in the quiet seconds when they think nobody is watching. She noticed the way my father lingered while folding laundry, carefully smoothing the soft fabrics between his fingertips. She noticed how he complimented colors instead of styles. She noticed that every Halloween, every costume party, every family play, he volunteered for the female roles with an enthusiasm that seemed oddly genuine. Nobody else thought twice about it. She did. Growing up, I believed my parents had the strongest marriage in the neighborhood. They laughed over burnt toast, danced while cleaning the kitchen, and somehow turned ordinary evenings into memories. My father was dependable, quiet, and endlessly patient. My mother possessed an uncanny ability to understand emotions before they were spoken aloud. They balanced each other. Or so I believed. Everything shifted during one rainy Saturday afternoon. I was supposed to be studying upstairs, but curiosity has a way of pulling people toward conversations they were never meant to hear. Their bedroom door wasn't fully closed. "I think you're tired," my mother said gently. "I am." "No." A long silence followed. "I think you're exhausted from pretending." Another silence. It stretched so long that I wondered if either of them had left the room. Then my father spoke in a voice so fragile I barely recognized it. "I don't know who I'd be if I stopped." Those words settled into the hallway like dust. I didn't understand them then. Years later I would. Life continued almost normally after that conversation, except I started noticing things I had never seen before. Dad spent more time helping Mom organize her closet. Mom started asking his opinion whenever she bought new scarves or sweaters. Instead of teasing him, she genuinely listened. "What do you think?" "I like the blue one." "Why?" "It looks peaceful." Peaceful. Not beautiful. Not fashionable. Peaceful. Mom smiled every time he used words like that. One evening she carried an old storage box down from the attic. It contained vintage clothing that had belonged to her grandmother. Nothing extravagant. Simple dresses. Cardigans. Long skirts. Soft fabrics worn smooth by decades. She placed the box in front of Dad. "I've been saving these because I couldn't bear throwing them away." He nodded. "They deserve another life." "So do you." He looked confused. "So do I." She reached into the box and lifted a faded cream-colored cardigan. "I've watched you admire textures for 25 years. He immediately looked away. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You don't have to." She held out the cardigan. "You can simply tell me how it feels." He hesitated, then accepted it. His fingers barely brushed the fabric before something changed in his face. Not excitement. Relief. Like someone finally breathing after holding their breath far too long. He closed his eyes. "It's softer than I imagined." "I know. I shouldn't like this." "Why?" "Because people would laugh." Mom sat beside him. "People laugh at things they don't understand." He stared silently at the cardigan folded across his lap. Then he whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. "I've always wondered." She smiled. "I know." The cardigan became a quiet symbol inside our house. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't displayed. Simply existed. Sometimes Dad wore it while reading. Sometimes while gardening early in the morning. If neighbors visited unexpectedly, he quietly changed into his usual sweater. Not because Mom asked. Because fear arrived faster than courage. Weeks turned into months. Mom never pressured him. She never said, "Wear this." She never said, "Become someone different." Instead, she asked unusual questions. "When do you feel most comfortable? What colors make you smile? What kind of clothes help you relax after work?" Questions nobody had ever asked him. Questions he had apparently never asked himself. Slowly, his answers became more honest. "I like lighter colors. I like softer fabrics. I hate stiff collars." I've always hated neckties. One afternoon Mom surprised him with a shopping trip. No dramatic announcement. No elaborate plan. Just a drive into another town where nobody knew them. They entered a department store. Dad looked terrified. His hands shook. I can't. You don't have to buy anything. What if someone sees? They'll see two people shopping. They'll know. They only know what they choose to imagine. They wandered through every aisle except the one he secretly wanted to visit. Eventually Mom stopped beside a rack of cozy sweaters marketed for women. She picked one up. This reminds me of the cardigan. Dad didn't move. She held it against herself. What do you think? It's nice. Would you wear something like this if nobody judged you? His answer came almost instantly. Yes. The honesty startled even him. Mom simply nodded. I thought so. Instead of placing it in her cart, she handed it to him. You carry it. His heartbeat practically echoed through the store. Every customer suddenly seemed impossibly close. Every glance felt enormous. Yet nobody reacted. Nobody whispered. Nobody laughed. People walked past without a second look. For the first time in decades, Dad realized something extraordinary. Most strangers were too busy living their own lives to inspect his. That tiny discovery felt larger than the entire building. On the drive home, he rested the folded sweater on his knees. He never wore it that day. He simply looked at it every few minutes, almost as if confirming it was real. When we reached home, Mom quietly said something that became a phrase repeated throughout the months that followed. The mirror isn't your enemy. Dad looked toward his reflection in the front hallway mirror. For years it had shown him only obligation, only expectations, only routine. Now, it asked a different question. Who are you when nobody else is answering for you? He stood there for a long time, the cream cardigan folded over one arm, the new sweater resting in the other, staring into the glass as though it held the beginning of a conversation that had been delayed for an entire lifetime. The mirror became part of my father's daily routine, but not in the way anyone outside our family would have imagined. Every morning before work, he stood in front of it wearing the same business clothes he had worn for years. Tie, pressed shirt, dark trousers, polished shoes. He looked exactly as everyone expected him to look. Yet every evening, after dinner and after the dishes were put away, he would pass by that same mirror again. This time he wasn't checking whether he looked presentable. He was searching for something much harder to recognize. My mother never rushed him. She understood that courage doesn't arrive with a dramatic speech. It grows quietly, one honest decision at a time. One evening, she folded the cream cardigan and placed it neatly over the back of his chair. You don't have to earn comfort, she said. He looked at her, puzzled. What do you mean? You've spent your whole life earning everyone else's approval. He lowered his eyes. When was the last time you gave yourself permission to simply be comfortable? He didn't answer. The silence was answer enough. That night, he wore the cardigan through the entire evening. Not because anyone asked him to, because for once he stopped asking himself whether he was allowed. I noticed the difference almost immediately. He laughed more. Not louder, just more freely. He lingered over his morning coffee instead of rushing through it. He hummed old songs while watering the plants. Even our dog seemed to sense that something inside him had relaxed. It wasn't the clothing that changed him. It was the weight he had finally begun to set down. Still, peace inside our home was only half the story. Outside those walls, the world had expectations. Dad worked at a small accounting firm where routine was practically a religion. Everyone wore the same colors, exchanged the same polite greetings, and avoided conversations that might make anyone uncomfortable. He fit perfectly into that environment. Or at least he had. One Friday evening after another exhausting week, he loosened his tie before even sitting down. I feel like I'm wearing someone else's uniform. Mom smiled softly. Maybe you've been wearing it for longer than you realize. He stared at the ceiling. I don't want to shock anyone. You don't have to. I don't want people to think I've become a different person. You haven't. He looked at her. You've always been this person. Those words settled over the room with surprising warmth. It wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about stopping the performance. A few days later, Mom suggested something unexpected. What if we started small? Small how? A scarf. He blinked. A scarf. Colors don't belong to anyone. He considered that. The next weekend they visited another store. Again in a town where no one recognized them. This time Dad walked a little taller. Not confident. Just less frightened. They wandered slowly through shelves filled with fabrics of every texture imaginable. Silk. Cotton. Linen. Cashmere. Dad reached toward a pale blue scarf almost without thinking. Then he froze. His hand hovered in the air. Mom noticed. Go ahead. He glanced around. I still feel like everyone's watching. She smiled. Then let's test that. She gently placed the scarf around her own shoulders before removing it and handing it back. Now you. He swallowed hard. His fingers trembled as he draped it loosely around his neck. He looked into the nearby mirror. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then something remarkable happened. He smiled. Not because he looked feminine. Not because he looked masculine. Because he finally looked comfortable. It feels right. Mom's eyes glistened. I know. They bought the scarf. Nothing dramatic happened. No gasps. No pointing fingers. No whispered comments. The cashier smiled politely, folded the scarf into a bag, and wished them a pleasant evening. Dad looked almost confused as they walked back to the car. That's it. Mom laughed. What were you expecting? I don't know. The world ending? He chuckled. I guess. The world usually keeps spinning. For the first time in years, he laughed without forcing it. Back at home, another tradition quietly began. Every Sunday afternoon, Mom and Dad would sit together in the living room with old family photo albums spread across the coffee table. They weren't reminiscing. They were studying. Photo after photo showed the same expression on Dad's face. Polite, responsible, reliable, but distant. As if every smile had stopped halfway. Mom placed one photo beside another. This was your promotion. He nodded. This was our anniversary trip. Another nod. This was when our son graduated. He smiled faintly. Then she pointed toward each picture. You're smiling. I am. But your eyes aren't. He looked carefully. For the first time he noticed it too. The smiles had belonged to everyone else. His eyes had always been somewhere far away. He quietly closed the album. I don't even remember what I was feeling. You were surviving. The sentence landed with unexpected force. Not living. Surviving. That realization haunted him for days. A week later he did something none of us expected. He asked Mom if she would teach him something. What is it? How do you choose clothes that actually express how you feel? She smiled so warmly that it nearly brought tears to my eyes. They spent the entire afternoon talking. Not about fashion but about emotion. This color feels calm. That fabric feels safe. This pattern feels cheerful. For the first time clothing wasn't a costume. It became language. Each piece said something words never had. The cream cardigan still remained his favorite. The pale blue scarf became second. Together, they represented two different chapters. The cardigan reminded him that acceptance begins at home. The scarf reminded him that courage can step outside. Then came the invitation that changed everything. Dad's company announced its annual family picnic. Employees were encouraged to bring spouses and children. Normally he looked forward to it. This year he dreaded it. He sat at the kitchen table holding the invitation long after dinner. Mom found him staring at it. You've been reading the same page for 10 minutes. I'm thinking. I know. What if someone notices I've changed? She tilted her head. They probably will. His shoulders sank. And if they ask questions? She reached across the table and gently rested her hand over his. Then answer the only question that matters. He looked at her. Are you finally becoming honest with yourself? He didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the hallway. Toward the mirror. The same mirror that had watched him wrestle with fear for months. This time, when he looked into it, he didn't see two different people. He saw one man. Still afraid. Still uncertain. But no longer hiding from his own reflection. And for the first time since this journey began, he whispered the words not to my mother, but to himself. I think I'm finally ready. The morning of the company picnic arrived with the kind of silence that only comes before an important decision. Dad stood in front of the hallway mirror longer than usual. The cream cardigan rested neatly on the bed. The pale blue scarf was folded beside it. He picked up the cardigan, ran his fingers across the familiar fabric, and smiled faintly. Months earlier, it had represented a question he was afraid to ask. Now it represented an answer he was still learning to believe. Mom stepped into the room without saying a word. She didn't offer advice. She didn't tell him what to wear. Instead, she stood beside him and looked into the mirror too. "What do you see?" she asked. Dad was quiet for several moments. "I see someone who's still scared." She nodded. "What else?" He took a slow breath. "I see someone who's tired of pretending." A gentle smile spread across Mom's face. "That's enough." He chose a simple outfit, comfortable slacks, a light sweater, the cream cardigan, and the pale blue scarf. Nothing flashy. Nothing designed to attract attention. Simply felt like him. Before leaving the house, he paused in the hallway. The mirror reflected a man who still looked unmistakably like my father. His posture was softer. His expression calmer. His smile no longer looked rehearsed. As we drove toward the park, almost no one spoke. The radio played quietly in the background, an old melody my parents had loved since college. Dad tapped his fingers gently against the door in rhythm with the music. "I haven't heard this song in years," he murmured. Mom smiled. "You always relaxed when it played." "I forgot that." "No," she replied softly. "You just forgot to listen." When we arrived, families were already scattered across the grassy field. Children chased soccer balls, co-workers laughed beneath picnic tents, and the smell of grilled food drifted through the air. Dad's grip tightened on the car door. "I can still turn around." Mom reached over and squeezed his hand. "You could." He looked at her. "But if you do, who are you protecting?" He thought about that question as we walked toward the gathering. A few co-workers waved. "Morning. Glad you made it." Everything seemed normal. For nearly 20 minutes, no one commented on anything. They talked about vacation plans, the weather, the latest office project. Life continued exactly as it always had. Dad slowly relaxed. Then someone noticed the cardigan. One of his coworkers smiled. "That's a nice sweater." "New." Dad hesitated. For a heartbeat, I saw the old fear return. Then he remembered the mirror. He remembered the words he'd whispered to himself. "I'm trying to wear things that feel more like me." The coworker blinked once, then shrugged with a smile. "Looks comfortable." "It is." "Good choice." And just like that, the conversation moved on. Dad stood there almost stunned. For weeks, he had imagined every possible reaction. Confusion, judgment, laughter. Instead, he received a compliment. Not everyone was so effortless. Later that afternoon, another colleague approached him with cautious curiosity. "You've changed a little lately." Dad nodded. "I have. You seem happier." He laughed quietly. "I think I finally gave myself permission to be." The colleague smiled. I was wondering what it was. There were no accusations. No dramatic confrontation. Just an honest conversation between two people. That evening on the drive home, Dad looked out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. "I spent years preparing for battles that never happened." Mom kept her eyes on the road. "Fear has a vivid imagination." He laughed. "It certainly does." The following weeks brought small but meaningful changes. Dad experimented with colors he'd always admired but never worn. Soft greens, warm creams, gentle blues. Nothing extravagant. Each choice felt less like a disguise and more like a sentence in a language he was finally learning to speak. At home, the atmosphere grew lighter. Our dinners became longer. Conversations became deeper. Dad no longer answered every question with "I'm fine." Sometimes he admitted he felt anxious. Sometimes hopeful. Sometimes uncertain. Ironically, the more vulnerable he became, the stronger he seemed. Then came an unexpected setback. One afternoon, while running errands alone, Dad overheard two strangers whispering as he passed. One of them chuckled. The other glanced in his direction before looking away. He never learned what they had actually said, but his mind filled in the blanks. By the time he arrived home, the confidence he'd built over months had begun to crack. He quietly removed the cardigan, folded the scarf, placed both inside the closet. When Mom came home, she noticed immediately. The mirror's empty. Dad sat at the kitchen table staring into a cup of untouched tea. Maybe this was a mistake. She sat beside him. What happened? I heard people laughing. Were they laughing at you? I don't know. She waited. I don't know. Those words echoed through the room. She gently stood and walked to the hallway. A moment later, she returned carrying the cream cardigan. She didn't hand it to him. She simply laid it across the table. Do you remember the first day you touched this? He nodded. You said it felt softer than you imagined. I remember. The cardigan hasn't changed. He looked down at it. The mirror hasn't changed. His eyes filled with emotion. The only thing that's changed. She smiled gently. Is that now you know who you are? Silence settled between them. Not an uncomfortable silence. A healing one. Dad slowly reached for the cardigan. His fingers rested on the familiar fabric. He smiled through tears. I let two strangers become louder than my own heart. Mom nodded. We all do sometimes. He stood, walked into the hallway, faced the mirror once again. This time he didn't ask whether he belonged. He asked something entirely different. Will I keep choosing honesty? The answer came without words. He slipped on the cardigan, wrapped the pale blue scarf gently around his neck, looked into the mirror, and smiled. Not because fear had disappeared, but because it no longer held the loudest voice. That night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Dad looked toward Mom and quietly said something I'd never heard him say before. Thank you. She smiled. For what? For seeing me. Before I could see myself. The tears in her eyes answered long before her words did. Ho's words stayed with me long after that rainy evening. Thank you for seeing me before I could see myself. I didn't fully appreciate their meaning at the time. Back then I thought this story was about clothes. It wasn't. The cardigan, the scarf, the mirror, they were never the destination. They were simply landmarks along a much longer road. One that led my father toward a quieter, more honest version of himself. The months that followed weren't perfect. There were still difficult mornings. There were still moments when Dad hesitated before opening the front door. Some days he chose the familiar business suit without a second thought. Other days he added a softer sweater or wrapped the pale blue scarf around his neck before leaving the house. The difference was simple. The choice was finally his. That freedom transformed him more than any article of clothing ever could. One Saturday afternoon, Mom suggested something neither of them had considered before. Let's clean out the closet. Dad laughed. I've been avoiding that for years. I know. Boxes soon covered the bedroom floor. Old jackets with worn elbows. Ties that hadn't been touched in ages. Shoes polished out of habit rather than affection. One by one Dad picked them up. Instead of asking, does this still fit? He asked something new. Does this still feel like me? It was a surprisingly difficult question. Some pieces went back into the closet. Many found their way into donation boxes. Not because they belonged to a man he no longer was, but because they belonged to a version of himself who had lived almost entirely to meet other people's expectations. When they finished, the closet looked almost the same. Yet somehow everything had changed. There was space now. Not just on the shelves. Inside him. A few weeks later, something happened that none of us expected. Dad's younger brother stopped by unexpectedly. Uncle David had always been outspoken. He was the kind of person who noticed every little detail. As soon as he stepped inside, his eyes landed on the cream cardigan draped over the back of the sofa. Then they shifted toward Dad. For a moment, the room fell completely silent. Dad took a slow breath. Months earlier, he would have rushed to explain himself. This time he simply waited. Uncle David looked at him for several seconds before smiling. You look lighter. Dad blinked. Lighter? Yeah. He shrugged. I don't know what you've changed. Another pause. But whatever it is. He smiled warmly. It's good to see you smiling with your eyes. Dad didn't say a word. He couldn't. The tears arrived before the sentences did. Later that evening, after Uncle David had gone home, Dad admitted something. I've spent years believing acceptance had to be earned. Mom looked up from her book. And now? He smiled. I think honesty comes first. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. Our family dinners became traditions again. Sunday mornings meant coffee on the porch while birds filled the garden with song. Dad laughed more often than I'd ever heard growing up. Sometimes he and Mom would browse clothing catalogs together, discussing colors and fabrics the same way other couples debated paint colors or vacation destinations. There was never any pressure. No dramatic declarations. No need to prove anything. The cardigan remained his favorite. The pale blue scarf still appeared on cool evenings. And the mirror changed the most. It no longer represented doubt. It became a quiet checkpoint. Whenever life grew overwhelming, Dad would pause in front of it, not to judge his reflection, but to ask himself the question that had guided him through every difficult step. Am I still being honest with myself? Most days the answer was yes. The days it wasn't became opportunities instead of failures. Years passed. People changed. Careers shifted. Neighbors moved away. The seasons painted our little house in endless cycles of green, gold, and white. Some things, however, remained wonderfully constant. One autumn afternoon, I returned home to visit my parents. As I opened the front door, I heard familiar laughter drifting from the kitchen. Dad stood by the stove stirring a pot of soup. The cream cardigan rested comfortably over his shoulders. The pale blue scarf hung neatly on a nearby chair. Mom was humming the same old song that had played in the car on the day of the company picnic. Dad looked up and smiled. Not the careful smile from old photographs. Not the polite smile he'd worn through decades of obligation. A genuine one. It reached his eyes without hesitation. Without effort. Without apology. Over dinner we talked about ordinary things. The garden. Family memories. Books. Weather. Nothing extraordinary. And somehow everything felt extraordinary. Because peace has a way of making ordinary moments unforgettable. As the evening came to an end, I wandered into the hallway. The mirror was still there. Older now. Its wooden frame carried tiny scratches collected over countless years. I stood in front of it for a moment, remembering the frightened man who had once searched its reflection for permission to exist. Dad quietly joined me. He noticed where I was looking and smiled. You remember? I do. He rested a hand on the edge of the frame. I used to think this mirror was judging me. And now? He chuckled softly. Now I realize it never judged me at all. He looked at his reflection one last time before turning toward me. It was only waiting for me to stop judging myself. Those words settled deep within me. I finally understood what my mother had seen all those years ago. She hadn't changed my father into someone else. She hadn't rewritten his identity or replaced the person she married.